My name is Howard White, I'm Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. If you've been here over the last couple of days, particularly on Monday, you've already met Marco Segone, the Director of Evaluation at UN Women, previously working at UNICEF, and has been very active, both as really the founder of Eval Partners and in work over the years on equity-focused evaluation. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you Marco, and ask him to present. Thank you.
Okay, once again, good afternoon to everybody. So the idea of this particular session was for me to kick off the discussion with a no more than 10 minutes talk, and then to organize ourselves in little groups so that we can have a little bit of a more participatory and engaging discussions. We are quite delayed, so I think there won't be any time for the different groups to brief back the plenary. But you know, we will just try our best with the time that we have. Mainly the idea is that we hear wonderful experiences on managing or conducting equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations. But I didn't hear a lot about the challenges that have been met and addressed, hopefully addressed, during the conduction and management of these evaluations. So the entire idea of this session is really to focus on what are the challenges based on the practical experience that we have in the room. I mean, in the room we have really a wonderful richness of experience. So the idea is really to share the different challenges and how those challenges have been addressed. And mainly, I would like just to go very quickly through an evaluation process. I mean, we just organize it around these 6 milestones. I mean, it doesn't matter. An evaluation process can be organized around 2 milestones, 10 milestones. So don't get too much focus on the 6th one, but it's just a way to say, to try to focus on what are the key challenges in each different milestones. So when we come to the preparing for an equity focus and gender responsive evaluation, here are, just generally speaking, the key steps. The first one is about the availability of the interventions, equities dimensions. And we know that the idea of the availability assessments is not to say, well, sorry, this intervention is not available because there is no theory of change, there are no baseline indicators, there are no source of evidence, etc., etc. That's not the idea. The idea is to, before you start the evaluation process, that you have this availability assessment to see what are the potential challenges in the evaluations. So if you realize that the intervention that you are going to evaluate has no theory of change, it doesn't mean that you cannot evaluate that. It means that you will have to include in the term of reference for your evaluation also the reconstruction of the theory of change. If in your availability assessment you will see that there are no baseline indicators, and in the case of equity focused and gender responsive evaluation, this is even more relevant because, as we know, disaggregated indicators, for example, are much more challenging to obtain. So once again, the idea would be, if we don't have baseline indicators, then the idea is not to say, well, sorry, we cannot do the evaluation, but the idea is to see and to already embed in terms of reference of the evaluation also the reconstruction of, for example, of the baseline indicators. There is a great book on how to reconstruct theory of change, on how to reconstruct baselines, data, etc. That is the real world evaluation by Michael Bamberger and Jean Roos. So I'm just telling you, if you want to know more about this, just go to that book. The second challenge is about identifying evaluation stakeholders. And in the case of equity focus and gender responsive evaluation, with a particular focus on the worst of groups and the related power relationship between the worst of and the best of groups. So that's also something, an additional complexity in the case of equity focus and gender responsive evaluation. The same is for identifying the intended use by the intended users. Well, that's Michael Quinn Patton, so if you want to know more about this concept of intended use, intended users, utilization focus evaluation, just look at the book by Michael Quinn Patton. But once again, I mean, in the case of gender responsive and equity focus evaluations, the idea is that we should not look at the usual suspect when it comes to the intended users. So we should not look only to the minister or to the head of the organization, etc., but we should look also really at the most marginalized groups. Then we have about ethical standards. Ethical standards are obviously fundamental to any evaluation, but in the case of equity focus and gender responsive evaluation, it's even more important. What are you going to do? I mean, if you are evaluating a program against violence, I mean, to address the violence against women, what are you going to do if you, during the evaluation process, you come up with cases of actual violence? How you are going to manage that situation? So the ethical standards for gender responsive evaluation is even more important than in any other traditional, let's say, evaluation. Ensuring appropriate budget. We already spoke that, generally speaking, equity focus and gender responsive evaluation are more complex than other evaluations. And therefore, generally speaking, they are more expensive. It's important that you budget rightly at the beginning of the evaluation so that you don't find yourself in the middle of the evaluation saying, well, sorry, you know, I mean, we need more time, we need more data, and therefore we need more budget, but then there is no budget, additional budget, and then you are just stuck in the middle of the evaluation. So it's much better that you plan this right in the beginning. And then it's really about identifying potential challenges in promoting and implementing equity focus and gender responsive evaluation. And here is just a list of potential challenges. When it comes to promoting equity focus and gender responsive evaluations, the issue is that you know, you may find situations where there is a reluctance to accept disaggregating indicators which can show the country performance or the program performance in a poorer light, because sometimes, you know, well, either we talk about a country or about a program, etc. If you look at the national average, maybe you remember the graph that I showed, I think, the first day. The national average was great, but then if you look at disaggregating indicators, that national policy was not looking as good as it was looking if you were looking only at the national average. So maybe somebody doesn't want to show those disparities. Sometimes there are political and social resistance to addressing the causes of exclusion and vulnerability. I mean, as we know, when we talk about power relationship, I mean, some marginalized group, they are marginalized for some specific reasons. It's not just the nature. I mean, it's just because how the society is structured. And therefore, the powerful, let's say, the most advantaged group or the best of groups, maybe they don't like the idea of having equity focus and gender responsive evaluations because they prefer to have the social structure, the power relationship as it is, the status quo, because that's best for them. The same argument is you may have resistance to empower the worst of groups. It's much better if the marginalized, they just stay in the corner, nobody hear about them. That's much easier. So you can have a resistance to empower of groups. And then also the lack of interest or incentive and reluctance to invest resources in worst of groups. At the end of the day, whatever country, whatever program we are talking about, the resources are limited. So when it comes to discussion on how to allocate the resources, you go to a very sensitive discussion. So these are all challenges, more kind of social political challenges that I think it's very important that we always take into account in the right beginning when we are preparing for the evaluation. But then there are also methodological challenges in the actual conduction of the evaluation. We already say that, generally speaking, when it comes to equity focused and gender responsive intervention, we are talking about complex interventions. So there are methodological challenges to evaluate complex intervention. You know, the lack of disaggregated data, or maybe the quality of the disaggregated data that are available. Sometimes even reluctance to change existing methodologies, also from us, from the evaluation community. I mean, we have been doing evaluation for the last 10, 20, 30 years in a certain manner, in a certain way. We are very comfortable on the way that we have done it in the past, and therefore, I mean, it's pretty human. I mean, that, you know, you have some resistance in changing and in embracing new methodologies, new approaches that maybe are more challenging. And as I said, additional costs and complexities. So these are all, and then, okay, the other one is particular challenges in regards of humanitarian settings. So these are all challenges that is very important that we are aware at the preparation stage of the evaluation so that we can come up with some strategy to address those challenges. When it comes to more to the term of reference, so okay, in addition to defining the scope and purpose, we also have to be very careful in framing the evaluation question so that also the evaluation question, they really focus on equity and gender. And as I already mentioned, the UN Evaluation Group came up with this handbook that I show in the slides in the first day on integrating human rights and gender in evaluation. And that's really a handbook that it goes step by step, starting from the evaluability assessment, going through the scope and purpose, evaluation questions, etc. And it even gives some examples of evaluation questions that are focusing on equity and gender. So once again, it's free of charge at the UNEG website, so feel free to download it. Selection of the evaluation team. Also, I mean, we need not only an evaluation team that is technically strong in evaluation methodologies, approaches, etc., but is also gender balanced and culturally sensitive. And very often, more and more, we will need to have evaluation teams where representative of the disadvantaged groups should be part, not only of the reference group or the management group of the evaluation, but also of the actual evaluation team. But that's additional challenges because often they are not evaluators, so it means that you have to include a component of capacity development for those groups. Designing the evaluation, I mean, there are many different designs, etc. This is just the bottleneck analysis that has been adopted mainly by UNICEF. Without going to the details because we don't have time, here the issue is only about that we should look both at the demand but also at the supply side factors, and we should look also at all the contextual factors, the economical, political, institutional, legal, etc. So it's just to say that we're talking about complex evaluations, and generally speaking, we are talking about mixed methods when it comes to gender responsive and equity focused evaluations. The importance of participatory and inclusive processes, I mean, I think that we already discussed about that, but of course, I mean, those once again are all additional challenges. And when it comes to the utilization of the evaluation, once again, I mean, the importance of the process use of evaluation. So, I mean, as you know, you can learn a lot. I think you can learn more through the process rather than by the actual evaluation report. So we should really use the process of an equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluation as a process to empower the disadvantaged groups by really actively engaging them in the evaluation process. the importance of alternative forms of reporting. When we are talking about disadvantaged groups, we are talking about not only about different languages, so the report should not be only in English, but it should be obviously in the local language. But sometimes, even if it's a report, I mean, we're talking about some populational groups that sometimes maybe they cannot read. So, I mean, maybe there are other ways other than a report to present the findings and conclusions. But once again, that is all adding complexity to the evaluation process. And also this morning we say that one challenge is how you communicate complexity in a simple manner. Because also policymakers, you know, I mean, they are not so interested in too complex programs and interventions. They want to know immediately from 2 to 5 minutes, they want to understand what's the key points, what's the key issue. They don't have the time to read our wonderful 100 pages report. So that was just a way to kick off the discussion. I mean, I went through it very quickly. And, oh, what I don't know, I mean, we have only, I think, about 20, 25 minutes. To me, the idea of this session, it was really to untap the richness of experience that is in this room. And so, with your permission, I'm not going to take any question, because the idea is that this should be the time when we can interact.
So can I say a few words and then we'll come to that?
Absolutely.
I'm joking. So, what are you going to say? Yeah. So I was asked if I had a PowerPoint. I wasn't planning a presentation as I'm the chair, but I will take the opportunity to say a few words. And because the session is about challenges, I'm going to talk about the challenge of bias and evaluation. And I'm going to talk about 5 biases: selection bias, separate study bias, agency bias, respondent bias, and enumerator bias. And these are all very important biases as evaluators we need to be aware of, and explicit recognition of bias and our own biases is the first step to designing studies and conducting studies that overcome those biases. So in evaluation, we can distinguish usefully between large N studies and small N studies. So large N studies are primarily quantitatively based evaluations using statistical methods to evaluate programs, and these have become very common, particularly in the field of impact evaluation, which is the domain in which my own organisation 3i operates. And what has been a focus of concern in these large and impact studies is to address the issue of selection bias. And selection bias is actually very central to the themes we've been discussing here today with gender and empowerment issues. Let's take the case of self-help groups. You go out and you use some measure of empowerment, and there are many measures of empowerment available. You can't say, oh, you can't measure empowerment, it's too intangible, or whatever. You can measure empowerment. So there are many ways, some good, some better, to do that. And you go out and you find that women in self-help groups are more empowered than women not in self-help groups. Does that tell you that self-help groups empower women? No, it doesn't, because there's selection bias there. It's very likely that it's more empowered women who are the ones who are joining self-help groups. So it's not surprising we find women in self-help groups are more empowered than women not in self-help groups. That's selection bias. So we need to have a study design that overcomes selection bias, number one. At 3IE, we don't believe that you should simply do a purely quantitative analysis, because you miss lots of contextual richness that Marco was stressing. So we believe very strongly in having a mixed method causal chain based analysis, which uses both analysis of the counterfactual, looking at the impact of the program, but also factual analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data around processes of that involving that program, how it's actually working down at the field level. So a lot of people talk about mixed methods. Marco mentioned it. The reality is achieving genuine mixed method studies in which both the quantitative and qualitative, the factual and the counterfactual, are truly combined is very difficult. There's a strong separate study bias. We have a quantitative team, we have a qualitative team, and they might have tea together, but that's about it. Yes? And if you put them in the same report, the only thing combining them is the paperclip. Yes? So they really don't actually work together. To achieve genuine mixed methods studies is a huge challenge. Anthropologists and economists, they don't like each other. They find it very difficult to work together. Okay, you need to overcome that bias. A lot of the process evaluations, the useful stuff we need to know, are going to be done using small-end methods. Now, we have a paper out on our stand on small-end methods, which is about trying to do attribution with small-end methods. But there's more to it than that. So actually, we had a very good presentation in the previous session of what I would call a rigorous qualitative study, where she explained in response to one of the questions that they made a matrix. And made a matrix of the responses from all the different the JRM reports that they got. Because if you don't do that, you're very prone to unsystematic data analysis, which cherry picks. So you've got to have rigor in both quantitative and qualitative methods. And there are methods out there, matrices are one of them, coding is another, to ensure you do rigorous qualitative analysis. There are lots of biases to actually prevent us from doing that. The first one is respondent bias. Now, if you're pure constructivist, you believe in a social construction of reality, which means actually no two people perceive the same social reality. I think that's quite an extreme position. There's a degree of positivism that has to be allowed for when doing evaluation. A theory of change is a positivist tool in the end. But I would agree that different people have different perspectives on things depending on where they're standing. And the physical analogy is very clear. I see the room differently standing here to how I was when I was sitting at the back. And it's the same around social phenomena. How different people perceive their interaction with the self-help group. We're very different between the SHG chair, a regular member, a woman who wanted to join the SHG and was prevented from doing so, the NGO supporting the SHGs. They will all have different perspectives. And it's not that one is lying and the others are telling the truth. They have different perspectives, they have different social positions. And the job of the evaluator is to reconstruct the reality of the program given those differing social perspectives. So when you talk to someone, you have to be aware of their potential biases. And there's a field of psychology in cognitive psychology called attribution theory. And at the heart of attribution theory in cognitive psychology is what's called the fundamental fallacy of attribution. People are really bad at attribution. So simply going and asking people, oh, what's happened to your livelihoods? What caused that to change? They haven't got a clue. That is not how to use participatory methods. Going out and asking people causal relationships is not a good use of qualitative data. You want to be unpacking their livelihoods, how they've changed over time, and identifying the causal mechanisms by other qualitative means. Direct questioning of, oh, did this project help you? It's just riddled with biases. It's a waste of their time, it's a waste of your time. You can do what you like with your time, but don't waste their time. So there's all these biases that all the respondents are going to have, okay? But we also have, of course, agency bias. The agencies want you to find their interventions work. So they're going to push you to go to communities where they know it's successful, push you to meet people that they think are going to say nice things about the program. I've been an evaluator for many years. You go to the field. It happened to me here in looking at the irrigation program in AP. I was with the World Bank, and we were meeting people from WAs, and there was a guy who wasn't meant to be there because he was from the tail end of the canal, and he was trying to raise issues about water scarcity, and they were just pushing him away and shutting him up. Yes? So this is what happened. The agency will want you to hear particular voices, not other voices. But actually, there's also evaluator bias. We have lots of biases ourselves. So one of those biases we know from cognitive psychology is we're more likely to be influenced by evidence that we're responsible for than we get from other sources. I first worked in SHGs, again in Andhra Pradesh, back in 2005, 2006. Wasn't great the story I saw there about what was happening in SHGs. And that, I admit, I know, colours my reading of more recent evidence emerging that SHGs actually do work and have positive impacts on empowerment. And I have to tell myself, okay, you saw something in AP 10 years ago, that's not necessarily how it is elsewhere or how it is now. Overcome your own priors. But there are other biases for evaluators. You know, who wants to be against programs to empower women? Now, how can you say this program's going out there, getting women together, poor women, illiterate women, put them into groups to empower them? How can you say, oh, but it's not working? People don't want to say that what looked like good things on the surface are unsuccessful and should not be funded. But I've been in a position where, for example, in Bangladesh, nutrition program for malnourished children in rural areas, to say, no, stop funding that program. It actually isn't working. Those resources can be better used. I worked on a study in the bank on rural electrification, and I said if the bank's serious about reaching poor people, it needs to put the money in grid extension, forget renewable energy. And people said to me, oh, how are you serious? How can you say don't invest in renewable energy? I said, well, this is the facts. If you're serious about reaching poor people, grid extension is just far, far, far more cost effective. And finally, of course, you get these biases that you go to the field. But when you're in the field and you're speaking to the agency, people relate to people like them. And the people like them are the project staff, the field workers. They make friends with those people. They don't want to upset them. They don't want to write that their project's not working. So you get this friends bias. You just write a nice report, you interpret the data to show the program's working because of your friends bias. You don't want to say your friends are doing a bad job. So there are all these biases. There's selection bias, technical issue, overcoming the separate study bias, the agency bias, the respondent bias, and your own bias evaluators. And you have to recognize all of those in any evaluation you do, or you won't be doing your job. Thank you.